Good evening and welcome to the Austin Software Cooperative's meetup group. I'm Watson, and today we're going to be reviewing the book Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism by Yanis Varoufakis. You can find it on Amazon. There's also an audiobook, and it's a pretty, um, I'd say it's a pretty easy read compared to some of the other things that we've been reading. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. If it's your first time joining us, I go through the book with a mind map. So if you haven't read it recently or at all, you can follow along. And I stop periodically so you can chime in on what you're thinking. So everything here, we try to view it in light of a software cooperative or employee ownership, that type of thing. And before I get started, are there any questions?
How do you access this mind map that you're showing? Can we access it?
Yeah, I think I put it in the recent emails.
Ah, okay.
If you don't have it, you can let me know. Let me throw it in the chat.
Ah, yeah, I see it on the email too. Thank you.
All right, I got it in the chat too.
Yeah, I see it. Thank you.
All right. All right, so I'm going to try to get through the preface in the first chapter. There's a couple counterintuitive, I could say, truths or counterintuitive positions in the book, um, depending on how familiar you are with capitalism, critiques of capitalism, these types of things. So let's get started. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And so this preface, we're just going to go what he's going to tell us about in the book and some of the positions he's taking. So here, capitalism is now dead. The role that's replacing it, he's calling it techno-feudalism. Okay, so he's going to say capitalism was actually killed off by capitalism itself, kind of like a virus that's overzealous and kills off its host. And he's going to describe some of the classic positions of a critique of capitalism, and why uh, that is relevant to the critique. Uh, he's some of the reasons why, at a high level, he's saying that it was the privatization of America and China's big tech, and the 2008 financial crisis. I also say that, okay, hold on here. Okay, we're good. Um, a little introduction to Yanis Varoufakis. He was uh, I want to say, a director. He's an elected official in Greece for I think it was called the Ministry of Finance, but he's like the finance minister for the country of Greece during the time of all of their kind of uprising and unrest, um, during, right after 2008. He's also an economist, and he taught at UT, but I haven't met anybody who had him at UT. Um, so he has a background in economics. He's written a couple books on game theory. Uh, so done lots and lots and lots of YouTube videos and debates as well. Fundamentally, the argument's going to mention a mutation, and you can kind of see this in critiques of capitalism. Uh, One of the, I guess, fundamental tenets or fundamental strengths, you could say, of capitalism is that it mutates and it's able to adjust or evolve to the um, situation that it's in. You can look at that as a good thing or even a bad thing. Um, it's used as a tool to critique capital, and so he uses that. So he's saying in the book, he's going to go in and talk about that capitalism has two pillars, markets and profits, and both of those have been demolished. He's going to talk about why. So here you say the markets, the medium of capitalism, have been replaced by digital trading platforms, which look like but are not markets and are better understood as fiefdoms. He's going to describe what feudalism is in the book in the first chapter. Profit, the engine of capitalism, has been replaced with its feudal predecessor, rent. And again, some of these analogies come from him teaching economics to his undergrads. So he's saying that the form of rent that must be paid for access to those platforms, if you can kind of think of Amazon, is what he has in mind. He mentions Amazon a lot on his YouTube videos. Real power today resides not with the owners of traditional capital, such as machinery, buildings or railways, and phone networks and industrial robots. Um, all of the people and companies that are in the old school capital, they've become vassals, and that's we'll talk about that in the book. But they are the people who basically collect the rent in relation to a new class of feudal overlord, the owners of cloud capital. So the rest of us, we've returned to our former status as serfs. All right. And then in the future chapters, 5, 6, and 7, which we'll be getting into probably next month or month after, he's going to recognize that our world has become techno-feudal, and it helps us, well, realizing that our world has become techno-feudal helps us to dissolve the puzzles of things like Elon Musk. Why did he decide to buy Twitter? The new Cold War between USA and China, um, the war in Ukraine, and um, things like crypto, what he calls a false promise of crypto, and the burning question of how we may recover our autonomy. Tries to address that at least. The description, a full description of techno-feudalism doesn't come until chapter 3 because there are some premises and I guess prerequisites for trying to understand what he's calling techno-feudalism, and we're going to go over those in chapter 1. So there's that. Any questions so far? Check the chat here. Jeff said that he worked as an economist for Valve. We kind of like Valve. They're kind of they're not cooperative, but they had a really cool employee handbook about how we kind of have organic work assignments and things. Really cool. They're a game company. Anything else? I'm gonna jump into chapter 1. right. I'll preface this chapter with talking about how he views capitalism, his critique of capitalism, and Marxism, and his view of Marxism. He has a unique view, and I think it's useful to try to distill some of the harder concepts. All right, so at a high level, I'm going to tell you what he has a discussion with his upbringing with his father, and he has a discussion of what capitalism is and the evolution that brought us to capitalism, feudalism, then capitalism. And some of these are independently discovered, I guess you could say discovered, or coined by Marx, but not exactly in the same way as the author Yanis has discovered them. So uh, the basic story is that there were different ages. You may have heard of like the Bronze Age and so on and so forth. And these ages and their development they coincide with some form of, and let me if you all hear echo, they coincide with some form of the evolution of capitalism. So here, let's see here, one second. He's saying copper had facilitated our deliverance from prehistory. Its ability to alloy with arsenic and tin made the harder metal bronze. And it gave us the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and the Archeans. It gave them new technologies, including new plows, axes, and irrigation, allowing them to ultimately to produce the large agricultural surpluses that funded the construction of splendid temples and murderous armies. Um, that was one age, and then another age is going to be this transformation of iron into steel. Right, so you had the Bronze Age, which was before steel, and then you had so Bronze Age became widespread after 4000 BC, and then you had this Steel Age, which took a long time. For a long time, iron and steel remained too difficult to produce, too expensive. And then we had some advances, one of them being Henry Bessemer, who invented a technique for producing large quantities of steel. And the argument is when his back and forth with his father, he's saying history accelerated to speeds which we are familiar with now when we started having steel. So here's a main takeaway from that section, though. Historical materialism, the method of understanding history as a constant feedback loop between, on one hand, the way humans transform matter, and on the other hand, the manner in which human thinking and social relations are transformed in return. So this part right here is going to be also embedded in Marxian thinking. So the way humans transform matter and the way that human thinking is transformed in return. Why does that matter? So we're talking about capitalism in the end. We're going to talk about these evolutions and how it adjusts to the environment that is going to be this fundamental description of what's called historical materialism. That's going to be a fundamental thing you need to kind of wrestle with, understand, or know that that's kind of a basic premise of these critiques of capitalism. Any questions so far? All right, let's get on. An overview of this section. So, the author uses Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity, and then later in the next section, general relativity, to talk about what you could call dualisms. So things that seem, the author Yanis is saying that they're contradictory. I'm saying they're paradoxical. It's a nuance. But things can have seemingly contradictory attributes. And he's saying that for different thinkers within economics, political science, they drew on some of Albert Einstein's thinking, and there was this again this interplay between materialism and how humans think. So you'll see in other literature people drawing on, or when they're trying to critique history, they will often cite some influential person in history and how their views influenced others. That's used a lot within critiques of capital. And so he's basically following in uh, that tradition. So essentially, Einstein had proved that light was both a particle and a wave, and that admits that something can be two utterly contradictory things at once. And he's saying that that influenced others. So, like within historical materialism, his father and himself, he's saying that capitalism, with these newfangled sources of wealth, by some strange or some strange weird spell, are turned into sources of want. Right. So this this is a Karl Marx quote, and he's saying that here we can expounds a bit. The power to shorten human labor, so new ways of manufacturing, all so on and so forth, being more productive. It also, for some strange reason, it can make more people starve or overwork, right? So turning a source of wealth into a source of want. And then he quotes this Communist Manifesto. This is kind of a famous quote: all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. Again, talking about this transformation and making something into its opposite. Why does that matter? We're saying the critique is this: capitalism has dualities that are contradictory. And again, going back to the premise or the preface, he's going to argue that capitalism ate itself, and what we have now is not capitalism. Now, here's a part that is unique to this author. He doesn't take sides. His father didn't take sides. And so he um, he's saying that things, and this is part of this historical materialism as well, things could go, there are like crucial points where things can go either way. And so things could have gone the way of where we should fear technology, and then things could go in the way to where technology liberates people. So things can become tyrannical, maybe going back to the point where everybody was feudalistic, or it can become an age where people have more freedom. And he says that it's not capitalism, or well, he's going to talk about that in the future, but these new findings, new ways of production, they don't necessarily mean that we're going to be um, enslaved to these new ways of production. It's going to be hierarchical and all this stuff. And that's where he says, uh, it's up to us to determine. Any questions so far? We're going to get into this introduction of capitalism. These two sections here are going to be the most important. He's using these tools. So if you could remember dualities, historical materialism, and dualities, he's going to use those to describe finally capital. I don't see any questions in the chat. So here we go. Here he's talking about, the left versus the right. There's many definitions of left and right. He's kind of using a more traditional definition here. He's saying leftists usually become radicalized by a reaction to violent injustices and mind-numbing inequality that capitalism generates. Not so in his case. His leftism had far more esoteric origins, a sensitivity given to him by his father, and it's this duality he talks about. And so now, again, you have that Einstein, light can be a particle or a wave. Let's apply that to wage labor. And so he's talking about his mom. And he says, oh, his mom was paid for her time and formal skills. And that was what's called, what he's calling exchange value of the hours she spent at work, not the true value of what she did at work. And now he's going to explain that. If you're going to watch a movie, the ticket price you pay reflects the movie's exchange value. But that is quite separate from the pleasure it gives you. And that would be the experiential value. These two concepts, these dualities get built upon, built upon, built upon. Why is it the duality thing? It's kind of how I interpret it, or how I find it useful, is they're counterintuitive, like things are hidden. You wouldn't think, you would think that, especially in the context that, in the West or what have you, exchange value is ingrained in us. The experiential value is not so much a thing that's ingrained, teaching about it, so on and so forth. So the duality, thinking in things or pointing out that something can have seemingly contradictory properties, that can be useful. And that's why he's doing that. So labor is split between commodity labor and experiential labor. So the effort, the passion, he's going to talk some more about that.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I'd like to just point that I think in the second paragraph here, you and he talks about that the exchange value is different from experiential value, but one can say that when the ticket price is being set, they are also set on how we value this experience. They're not set on basically how much it costs to produce a movie or to stream it. It's like how much the customer can willing to pay to experience to watch a movie. I mean, in this particular example, at least it works. I
Yeah,
think
it's funny because this example he gives here, it's talking about the consumer, and he gives his other examples are about the producer. So, and the example, like he's saying, okay, the ticket price doesn't capture the extra that the artist puts in to the work. And we're gonna talk about that here, right here. So like here, labor's second nature, the experiential labor that my mother first alerted me to. Consider the brilliant idea conjured up by a group of brainstorming architects employed by a multinational construction firm, or the positive vibes a waiter emits on the restaurant floor, or a teacher's tear of joy when a challenged pupil solves a difficult math problem. None of these can be commodified. So he's saying the things that can be commodified can be put in this exchange value, but the things that can't are this, and this has like a million names and within Marxian and all this other stuff. Some call it surplus value, uh, all this. So he's given it the name experiential value. It's the little bit extra, and this concept, this separation, is used to give an argument in the future, in the book, about what capitalism is. So this is a critique of capitalism, and saying, well, we're going to get to it, but I think we're going to get to it right here. Yeah, we're going to get to it right here. So let's jump in. Um, so again, some of this, no monetary reward can prompt a moment of true inspiration. Again, this is talking about the producers. Bosses who try to quantify, price, or commodify experiential labor will sound like the fool who yells at you, be spontaneous. Obviously, if someone's telling you to be spontaneous at a specific time, it's not going to be doable. Um, let's see here. So, all right. What I call experiential labor, the part that never can be sold, Marx called simply labor. And what he's labeled commodity labor, Marx defined as laboring power. We're going to talk about that. And he didn't read Marx till later, so that's, he started overlapping some of his concepts there. So here's probably the most, one of the, I guess, premises of the book and critiques of capital, and one of the hardest things to get about, you could say, a Marxian critique. There's other critiques that aren't Marxian, but they still form under this critique of capital. This thing here, capitalism's secret, the uncommodifiable sweat, effort, inspiration, goodwill, care, and tears of employees are what breathe exchange value into the commodities that employers then flog over to eager customers. This is actually what makes the building a restaurant school desirable. Here, when we get down to here. Um, Another premise, employers cannot buy the effort put in by unskilled laborers. That sounds counterintuitive because it seems like they do. But he's saying, no, they can only buy your time. So this teasing out, this duality it gets developed over and over. This is the secret power of employers to extract any surplus, either from highly skilled or from uninspired, repetitive, robotic work. They must pay for their time. That's commodity labor. But they cannot actually buy the sweat, which is the experiential labor. Why does that matter? Now, this is the part. to try to understand. Capitalists owe their profits to an inability, to the impossibility of buying the experiential labor directly. And yet, what a boon to suffer such an incapacity for. He's saying because they can't buy, that's what allows the system to work. It's counterintuitive. It's ultimately they who pocket the difference between the exchange value they pay for employees in exchange for the commodity labor and the exchange value of the commodities created thanks to their experiential labor. In other words, labor's dual nature is what gives rise to profit. Okay, now let's go back to the ticket example and all of this stuff. If the, let's say, the whole movie industry or what have you, right? If that the price of paying the artists, the actors, the people that clean in the movie theater, service with a smile, if all of that was represented in the price that the labor had, so if the actor was able to not just get paid just for dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but they were also able to get paid for that little bit of extra why people come to see them, their inspirational, their tears, these types of things. If they were able to get paid for that, the employer it would be a zero sum. They wouldn't be able to get a profit. It's because they don't pay them for that extra, the surplus, what have you. That's where they can get paid. They can get a profit. This is in contrast to saying, oh, the employer took the risks. Oh, the employer put the money up front. Again, saying risk or what have you, other things. They had all the tools, they bought the tools. Kind of goes into maybe a lot of arguments about risk. The argument here is that is secondary to the idea that you can't, and it's impossible to pay for the total amount of the experiential value. Does that make sense?
Does he touch on at all? Does he mention the commodity fetishism? Because it seems
Nope.
like it's super at all. Wow.
Nope. He doesn't. This is like his view, and getting into direct Marxian critique and going into he's basically avoiding that on purpose, in my opinion. So he's trying to give, here's a critique. His way of critiquing, it just so happens to align with a lot of the literature and the traditions in some ways. And then he steps back and says, okay, you don't have to really accept all of it, is what I'm thinking, right? Because I think if he goes and says, this is pure Marx, then you have to accept all the critiques of Marx. Then I think he's saying, well, here's what I am using. So here we go. The dominant propaganda today, and while he's growing up, is that profit is the price or reward of a thing called capital, and that people who have capital, such as tools, raw materials, money, anything that can be used to produce saleable goods, make a profit by deploying it in the same way that a worker makes a wage by deploying their labor. And so he noticed all this twin nature. He's saying before he read Marx, and he's saying commodity capital, like a fishing rod or any good that is produced to be used in the production of other commodities. That's one form. And then capital's second nature, again, going into this dualism. Suppose that you discover that, he's saying that I possess tools that you need in order to produce the stuff for your family's survival, such as the aforementioned fishing rod, tractor, server, whatever. Suddenly, I've acquired the power to make you do things. Okay. So that would be this power capital he's calling. So he's saying capital is both a thing, so commodity capital, and a force, the power capital, just as labor is split between commodity labor and experiential labor. So this power, these concepts, there's the arguments for the concepts that he's coming up with, but then there's just you can look at it as a model. And this power capital, he's going to use that later to say maybe it's intuitive that people that have power over you, and basically if you really can't get another job because there's really no work out there, the person that's employing you has a certain amount of power over you. He's just teasing that out, really. Any questions so far? All right. So now that was, he's even called it a peculiar introduction to capitalism. This one is important as well for the critique of capital. So we're going to talk about money, and we've got about 20 minutes. So let's see. The dual nature of both labor and capital led him to the dual nature of money. And again, we've got Einstein. Now you had the special theory of relativity from Einstein, and then you had the general theory. So again, these are analogies, but this analogy actually influenced an economist. So that's why it's important. If you want to understand gravity, Einstein explained you need to stop thinking of space as a box that the universe comes in. Matter, energy, operating as one, mold the contours of space and shape the flow of time. The only way to wrap our minds around space and time, or matter and energy, is to think of them as partners locked in the most intimate and soluble embrace. Okay. So the point here to take away, you have to think of space and time, or matter and energy, as partners locked. You can't separate them is the argument. All right. Now, you have that from Einstein. Now, you have an economist named John Maynard Keynes. He's the Keynesian economist, very influential in the West. So he had a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And he evidently met Einstein, and this name is influenced by Einstein's general theory of relativity. Why? He's saying just how the general theory of relativity was a break from Euclidean geometry and so on and so forth. What Keynes was coming up, he was trying to say we need to have a break. And what's the break? The break is that you have to think of money differently. So he's saying conventional economic thinking about money was damaging humanity. And he's saying traditional economists are kind of like Euclid, and they need to move to be more like Einstein. And so here's a first stab at it, at the misunderstanding. They were using illusions, which, while helpful in the microcosm of the single market, right? So the market in potatoes, where a fall in price can usually be relied on to boost sales. So that were, if you apply that concept to, this is the supply demand, right? To the economy at large, the macro economy, he's saying that's tragic. A fall in the price of money, the interest rate, may never boost the money's flows in the form of investment and employment. So he's saying money is special. It's a special commodity. And you can't separate it. And we're going to get there, but you can't separate it from what we do, is what the argument that John Maynard Keynes has. So he wanted us to stop thinking about money as a thing and simply as another commodity. It stands outside or apart from our other activities in markets and workplaces. And he says that again. And he's saying that money is a reflection of our relation to one another and our technologies. This means the means and the ways in which we transform matter. And he goes and says, Marx said something like that too. Money is the alienated ability of mankind. Any questions so far? These are kind of tough concepts. Money itself is just a tough concept. Does anybody have, does anything here jump out to anybody as just completely wrong? All right. Let's go. We got one more piece. Now we're getting into feudalism. So we will. He says that he's a libertarian Marxist. It's basically contradictory. He's saying that he values freedom and tolerates capitalism, so on and so forth. Let's get into this critique. So during the feudal era, which became properly entrenched across Europe in the 12th century, economic life involved no economic choices. If you were born into the landed gentry, it would never cross your mind to sell your ancestors' land. And if you were born a serf, you were compelled to toil the land on the landowner's behalf, free of any illusion that one day you might own the land yourself. Why is that important? It's a kind of a separation between feudalism and economics, because there were markets back then. So it's strange. There's been markets, forever. So what is the difference? Neither land nor labor power was a commodity. They had no market price. The vast majority of the time, ownership of them changed only through wars of conquest, royal decree, or as a result of some catastrophe. So there you have one difference between feudalism and capitalism. There's some stages in between there, but we're simplifying here. His argument is that this view that the British landlords saw that they could make more money if they evicted the serfs. Then they started having enclosures, and the landlords would lease the land to the evicted serfs, and then they had a choice to work or not work, right? So all of this is the beginning of capital. And he talks about like this, it's kind of really a contradictory view that, or a weird situation that you're in that, they're saying comes to this day, which is part of the critique of capitalism. You're free to choose a bad situation. And he's saying that's not real freedom. So his view is that in order to have real freedom, we need to have more options, and not kind of these whittled down options. Bringing it back to the idea of the book, you really don't have a real market when you go onto Amazon. And he's saying, again, to widen it even more, the more controversial view, most of the people that we think are very, extremely wealthy, a lot of them are vassals, merely vassals as well. They're basically paying cloud rent to all of the people who are collecting. We reviewed a book called Surveillance Capitalism. Of course, we know about all what we call the hyperscalers, the Googles, the Apples, so on and so forth. For anyone to be, I guess, in the technology space, or to be influential in those places, which basically is kind of almost just, anything that's going to be making money now, you are going to have to pay some type of rent in such a way, which brings us back to times before capital. So he's going to develop this argument throughout the book, and I think that may be a good place to stop. Is any questions so far? Did this kind of illuminate ideas of what capitalism is, or critiques of capitalism, let's say? Did it just seem like it was just way off?
To me, I think there's a lot of very complex concepts that he uses. Yeah, it looks like he reinvents terms, which we're trying to at least present them in a new way, but I'm not always sure what new that brings to the concept, like with like this duality again. And I'm not sure. I've watched a lot of interviews with him, with the author, and I think he was trying to promote the book. So he basically described on the surface level everything that he says in the book about feudalism and the state of capitalism.
Yeah, these concepts, I think why he does it is, if you just come out and say, here's where Marx was right as far as his critique, then you really can't even be an economist in the United States. There's very few Marxian economists here. You can't major in it or anything like that. Every time I meet somebody who's taken, like they did their undergrad in economics, they never read Marx. And so when that one blurb that I put in there where he said the propaganda of what capital is now, that kind of thing, that's because it's kind of a slight. It's like we don't get critiques of capital when you take, even as an undergrad, as your major, economics. The most that you get is a view of John Maynard Keynes, and they look at him as like the critique of capitalism. Whereas somebody that's a Marxist is like John Maynard Keynes is a full-blown capitalist. He's just has some things where he says, here's some things where markets don't work. One of them is money, which we've accepted at this point. We have said we're going to control the interest rate of money, period. We're not just going to let it just do whatever. We're going to have central banks. Nobody avoids that at this point. But there could be, you could say that you could critique that and say, well, that allowed for a lot of the corruption for people who can print money and all that. You can come back at that, but that's still, capitalism. He's just pointed out one place or a few places that said, not so fast over here. But yeah, it's basically, you will get, blacklisted if you are, a Marxist or what have you. So that's what I think. But
He is quoting Marx by not quoting Marx. Is that?
yep,
No,
yeah,
but can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, I mean, there's another reason too. I mean, he's now very actively involved in trying to change people and build a broad movement. So just like he did with the prior book addressed to his daughter, he's set himself the task of trying to explain these things in a popular way so that he can reach a broad audience.
Yeah, yeah. It's from my understanding, people who like to critique capital, they like Marx. They like him. They like his descriptions. They find them to be more rigorous. So, uh, that's where I'm kind of like, well, if you're, it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If your audience is someone already who's open to critiquing, they might respond well to some of the traditional literature that has lots of people referencing it already and explaining it. It seems like somebody's got a question.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. I mean, in terms of, is Marx like some sort of, I don't know, like a giant stumbling block that, yeah, if you don't find Marx's critique of capitalism not serious, basically, if you have a critique of capitalism, but you don't happen to be a Marxist, then, you are just some, wholly liberal or somehow misguided, because there have been many other critiques of capitalism, but somehow, I don't know, it's like, it almost seems to me the analogy like if psychology was at one time stuck in Freudianism, and, it took like a huge generations long fight to, get over Freud, shall we say. And that doesn't mean by any stretch of imagination that, people's psychological problems have gone away. But nonetheless, people are not, getting, wrapped around the axle over Freud and, parsing his sentences and having learning debates on what did he really mean and all that stuff. So anyways, just a thought that, like, are there other critiques of capitalism which aren't necessarily Marxist?
There's definitely schools of critiques. The it's one interesting thing is, say, for capitalism, if you were quoting Adam Smith all day, then people who are, let's say, a modern economist, libertarian capitalist, they're gonna say you lost your mind. There's been iterations since then. So somebody they have the Austrian school, they have the Chicago school, they've got the school, I can't remember, it's like basically Harvard MIT school. But they aren't like Adam Smith, right? And but for critiques of capital and Marxian, like, it's back to, oh no, you're a Marxist. Like, they don't allow it to evolve. So what you've teased out is, you even saying you have a different view, it's damned if you will, damned if you don't kind of thing. They'll try to lump you into Marx, and then there's the traditional critiques of Marx that they'll get you with. And if you say, no, 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 I'm not Marx, it's kind of like, thou doth protest too much kind of thing. You just don't want to quote him because you don't want to be lumped in, but yet you are. You're just scared. Just go ahead and take the heat kind of thing. So it's really hard to navigate, I find, with authors. But yeah, the newer critiques of capital, the Frankfurt School is one. I think they're pretty influential. That's who I would say that they would be probably the big influencers of a critique of capital now. And they have I think Jose was talking about the commodity fetishism. They do a lot of work on all these other things. They kind of, you brought up Freud, they kind of are influenced by psychology. They talk a lot about ideology. It's a mystery, the whole mystery of why the workers haven't risen up yet and fought against the employers. A lot of it is that. Or why do people why do they even why does it seem like they don't even want to fight, kind of thing. All of this, there's lots of that critique. Marx had some of that, but there's other schools too.
No, they were Marxists too, right?
Yeah.
And well, unorthodox. But yeah, I have to actually jump off very soon. But there's a guy, Eugene McCarraher, who is a professor somewhere in, I forget where, somewhere in the Midwest maybe. But he has written a book called The Enchantments of Mammon, Mammon, and which is, as my understanding, some sort of a basically religious critique of capitalism. In fact, he says that capitalism itself has become a religion. So if anybody's interested, in the Toronto Philosophy Meetup, I think they'll be going over that book over the next maybe almost 3 months, something like that. So if anybody wants to check that out, Eugene McCarraher in the Toronto Philosophy Meetup.
What's the philosophy meetup? Is that Austin meetup? What's the name of the meetup group?
Toronto Philosophy Meetup. It's like 11,000 members, one of the largest, meetups.
Let me write it down here. 1 second. It sounds good. All right. Toronto Philosophy Meetup. Is it on meetup.com?
Yep.
All right.
No, I mean, it just seems like something which hasn't gotten a great deal of, academic uptake, maybe because he's coming from a religious perspective, but, who knows?
Yeah.
It might still have some interesting thoughts.
For sure.
Cool. Thanks.
All right.
Nice.
Anything else from anyone? I think that's it.
Yeah, I just want to say that, whether people refer or over refer back to Marx, it's almost like a testament to how still applicable or relevant some of those concepts are, and how, of course, the way that usually we work is referencing back whoever came up with the concept first, if that makes sense. And then, of course, you can expand. But as you also said, it almost got stuck, the discourse or marginalized. So it's difficult to have more schools of thought come in. Even the Frankfurt School of Thought, I mean, if you really look at it, it's like, well, there's a lot of Marxist concepts there. They were more critical of perhaps, Lenin or maybe the more, that more advanced or iteration, right? But after all, the basics, like what I was saying, that commodity fetishism, you can call that many different ways, but, even I don't think that's Marxist. It's actually somebody else's. I can remember. But still, he's the guy that popularized it, right? So, but but yeah, I'm and also, of course, yes, there's many angles to framing the critique to capital, and it's interesting to read them all because in a way they're all connected. There's always kind of talking or alluding at least from my point of view, to very similar things. They're just like framed in various different cultural contexts, right? That's always interesting to see.
Yeah, it's I find it very interesting. I mean, a simple question to anybody major in economics: who do you think is the best critic of capitalism? And They'll never say Marx. They don't say anyone, but they won't say Marx. I find that to be propaganda induced.
I'm gonna ask that question to yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna trigger people with that question.
Yeah, it's triggering, and but it's thought provoking, because if someone were to push back, if someone were to say Marx is the best critic, I would, for me, if I were to push back, it would be he's kind of hard to read. That's how I would push back. But the concepts, the modeling, I don't know. I mean, he's the most influential. The models that he has, I don't think anybody's come up with better models for critiquing, just thinking about class, things like that. I don't think there's a better way, or there could be a better way, but I don't think there's a way that isn't influenced by him. That's influential. That's what I mean. Like, he's the most influential. So from that perspective, I'd have to say he's the best. There are things that I would be like, in the Communist Manifesto, it says, um, you know, basically has arguments against free press, like government should control all of that. I have a hard time with that, other things like that. But